So everyone, we'll get started in a few seconds. Thanks for your patience.
Yeah, good idea. Yeah, that's true. That's a good idea.
Okay, I think we're gonna get started now. Just Atena's trying to join and she can't for some reason. Okay. So hello everyone, and welcome to this event on Asylum, a Socialist View on the Refugee Crisis, which is the name of the pamphlet that we are launching this evening. My name is Chloe and I'll be chairing tonight. But before we begin, I would like to start by recognizing that I am speaking on stolen land that was never ceded, the land of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people, and that the struggle for First Nations sovereignty is deeply connected with the struggles against racism and border imperialism. We will never achieve true justice in Australia until we achieve First Nations justice. We will also never achieve true justice in Australia until we achieve justice for refugees. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I would also like to acknowledge all of you in the room today, comrades, supporters, anyone who has not been to the Resistance Centre before or attended any of our events, welcome. And thank you for coming here in person, and to all those joining us online. I hope you can hear me clearly. And I also acknowledge any refugees who have joined us today, including some of our speakers. This event was organised to launch our new pamphlet, which gives a really good overview of the global refugee crisis, but it also aims to provide activists and anyone concerned about human rights for refugees with the basic facts and arguments, as well as an analysis of the imperialist roots of the global refugee crisis. And we all know the horrendous treatment of refugees here, which is the work of successive governments. Both Labor and the coalition are responsible for the years of arbitrary detention, boat turnbacks, the murder of refugees, and unnecessary suffering of people seeking safety from war, persecution, hunger, and global warming. As socialists, we argue that the current refugee crisis is a product of capitalism, a system that creates mass inequality and divides the world along the lines of poverty and wealth. But we do have a range of perspectives tonight from 4 great speakers, and I'll just read them out. First, we'll hear from Hassan Jaber from Justice for Refugees, and a refugee himself, stuck on one of these horrible temporary visas. Then we have Mari Hapke, a longtime refugee advocate and convener of the Refugee Advocacy Network, who will reflect on the refugee issue in Australia and also how the refugee movement has carried on. Then we'll hear from Atena Kashani, an Iranian asylum seeker and high school student who is on a bridging visa as someone who has not received recognition of their refugee status, and was also one of the children the Australian government locked up in detention. And lastly, we'll hear from Andrea Bortoli, refugee activist and Socialist Alliance member, who will give us a socialist and also a wider, more global perspective on the reasons why refugees are being treated unequally or appallingly, why it's happening all around the world. After the speakers, we'll have some time for discussion and questions, so please stick around. I'm going to hand it over to Hassan. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and nice to see most of the friends here. And also, I'm really excited to see new faces in the online. So thanks for everyone to coming today to support refugee and people seeking asylum. I would like to start by acknowledging the original people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which we stand. I pay my respect to the elders and past and the present. This land was stolen and never ceded. This was and always will be the Aboriginal land. Again, so great to see you. And I would like to acknowledge people coming from this weather. And I know that it's very hard and cold. And thank you for the online again. My name is Hassan Jaber. I am leading a group called Justice for Refugee. I came in Australia in 2012. And I have temporary protection visa. It's called Safe Haven. Actually, my visa today, it's expired. So now I am without visa. So we are movement, it's called Justice for Refugee. We established in August 2019. We are living in Australia for more than 10 years. Under the new asylum seeker policy that discriminates against us besides our method and arrival in Australia. This policy is known as a fast track. This system has failed us with unfair assessment process, no right for the permanent protection, no chance to be with our family again. We are here to seek protection and safety because we're struggling from our country and we're not coming here for holiday or find another. Myself, I am stateless. I am from Kuwait. I came here to seeking protection because I had issue with the government in Kuwait because I am human rights advocacy in Kuwait. So unfortunately, when I came here, I struggled a lot with like no right for study, no right for working, no right for living as a human being. Those Australian and human policy that offer us with no secure future and banished us with because we are seeking protection. Almost the decade in Liberty government that had denied our rights. People who seeking asylum in Australia, one in the wealthiest country in the world. Thousands of men and women and the children continue living here in Australia with no certain future. Many of those people rely on the charity, and if they cannot find job or any work to support their families, some of them didn't have right to work and no access for the Centrelink or the health card or the NDIS. Even if someone like disability, they cannot have any access from NDIS as well. I just went yesterday for the New South Wales to support someone. He's lost his father and without saying goodbye. And this is really frustrating for him. And I know this feeling because I lost my father as well, 2017. However, I met with someone, his disability there, and I hate to say disability, but he's in the wheelchair and, and he just like saying for me that, Hassan, what we're gonna do? It's been 10 years we're struggling here. What we gonna do? Honestly, I don't know what I'm gonna say for her. So we've been here in Australia 10 years, living in those temporary protection visa. This means not being access for many government supporters for the service, or that for only services for the people in the citizenship or people who have permanent protection visa. Without access for the permanent visa, many refugees on temporary protection visa have not been to access Australian family reunion or humanitarian program to get the wives or the children. Many people, they get separated with their wives and they didn't see their children. It's been 10 years. For the past decade, we have been denied for the freedom. We sought humanitarian aid and expect from the conflict, violence, and persecution of our homeland. Many people are deeply suffering mentally and physically and financial hardship. When we waiting for years in limbo, and some of them bridging visa, many of those they have organized as a refugee, but without any rights. As someone in the temporary protection visa expired today, I can tell you that it is very difficult to feel complex about building your future in Australia. When your visa has been expired for 2 or 3 years or 5 years, after that, you don't know exactly what you're gonna do. Myself, I have a lot of struggling just because of my visa. Most of the people who have TPV's visa, they cannot find jobs because they not accept people in the temporary protection visa, because asking for people who have PR. We are exhausted for 10 years. We're struggling here without any certain future. I have Australian born here, 2 children born here in Australia and citizenship, but I do not have any security to stay in Australia. The Australian government organized me as a refugee and give me the temporary protection visa for 5 years. But my visa, as I mentioned earlier, it's expired. However, last month I received letters from the government saying that if the department of the Home Affairs refuse you, you will expecting to go back for your country. As someone who's like a stateless, I cannot do that because I'm stateless, so I don't have any country. Last month, I received from the Home Affairs letter saying that your children now allowed to apply for the SHAVE visa. I replied for the email and I said, my children, they're Australians. But this is making me to stop and think about the people, 9,700 people, who's they reject them. And the reason was because your country is safe. When you go in the online and check, it's saying Iraq or Afghanistan or Sri Lanka is not safe country and it's red zone. But with the immigration saying for you, go for your country, it's safe. For the last 10 years, Morrison government and Tony Abbott's government is cruel for the people seeking asylum and refugees. Morrison government and Tony Abbott makes us mentally and physically tired. Morrison, when he was in the Tony Abbott government, he was the immigration minister, and who's put this the fast track policy. However, as a refugees, with you guys as a supporter, we're not gonna stay quiet anymore. We need to fight. And we need to put more pressure for the MPs and the government as much we can. As a refugees, now we're struggling more and more, and we're really stressful. I believe that the political people have this, and some of us have this feeling in the election, 21st of May. We didn't know who's gonna win. Now, as a refugees, we receive a lot of calls every week, more than hundreds. People just struggling. When is gonna be? When they're gonna establish? We must be as a higher priority. Why we are now, no one care about us. I will say that on behalf of all the refugees, we will thank you as a people who's always supporting us. And really, this is like the first time I having a Zoom or meeting with Mari here. And I would like to say front everyone, thank you for everything, because always you're supporting me and ongoing support for everyone and the refugees. Thank you, everyone. And I'm just stuck with the time, but there is unfortunately a lot of story from the refugees and people really struggling. Yesterday, when I was in the New South Wales, I just like saw the friends, most of them like this just come with the white bear. I said, wow, I just thought myself, so everyone here. So I believe that people really struggling, people really like they're damaging people too much. Imagine that without your family for 10 years is too much. This is time together as Australians to say enough. And again, I would like to thank everyone here for inviting me for the talk, and thank you for people for the online people. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hassan. Yeah, we think you gave us a really good insight to what it's like living on a temporary protection visa, and it is outrageous that you have to live in a constant state of fear and limbo, even getting thrown back into detention. And it's the story of so many asylum seekers. So we will keep fighting to abolish temporary protection visas, which are really prisons without walls. I would like to now introduce our next speaker, Mari Hapke, who is a longtime refugee advocate and convener of the Refugee Advocacy Network. Thank you, Mari.
Thank you, Chloe. Welcome, everybody. Good to see people here, and a good number of people online as well. That's fabulous. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of Aboriginal people and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, those who are emerging, and recognise the central part that Aboriginal people play in Australia. And at last, and hopefully more fully, we'll come to recognise and acknowledge that. Very encouraging, I think, isn't it, that this government has made a commitment to the Statement of the Heart and taking action on that. Small steps, but important ones. Thank you, Hassan, for your kind words. I have known Hassan for nearly 3 years.
Since 2019.
Three.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. COVID's done strange things, hasn't it, to time. I first met Hassan. He contacted me. I don't know how you got onto me, but anyway, because you were organising a rally about permanent protection visas. No surprises. You've heard Hassan talk about the difficulties of temporary protection. And Hassan also mentioned that back in Kuwait, part of what got you into trouble really was that you were organising and being politically active. And I think all of you people here understand the importance of political activism. Happily, here in Australia, we generally don't pay a high price, but in many countries, people pay a very high price for being politically active. So good on you for having that will to fight the system. And I can assure you Hassan's brought that here with him to Australia, and good for you as well. And it's quite moving, actually, because Hassan is pretty robust, but I hear that little tremor when you speak about your visa being expired. And hopefully it will be renewed. But of course, Hassan has no agency around that. It's entirely in the hands of the bureaucracy as to whether or not they choose to renew that visa. And as you've said so clearly, Hassan, that's a situation that just thousands actually of people on TPVs and Chevs, people on bridging visas. There are, I think, something like 30,000 people on bridging visas. Many of those are only 6 months, 12 months. Every time that comes around, you can imagine the anxiety that creates. And of course, being without a visa means that technically you don't have a right to work, you don't have many other rights, and you're in a very, very invidious situation. As you mentioned, Hassan, a lot of people, hundreds, perhaps thousands of people, are in that space of not having a visa purely for administrative kind of reasons. The department's somehow not got around to renewing the visa. I really hope that doesn't happen for you, Hassan. But so the administration of a lot of these things is chaotic. Obviously, the movement, we always wonder how much of it is chaos, how much of it's intended. It's very difficult to make up your mind around that because we know the system is so punitive that, you know, all of these sorts of things come into play, and we do have to question often the motive or the drivers for these things. Now, TPVs, we know that they were introduced back in the early 2000s. The Labor government, when they came in, did abolish TPVs back in 2007. That was one of the very important things that Labor did. And the reason for that was that it had been shown, there had been studies done on the damaging effects, exactly as you've said. And the greybeard's a great sort of image, isn't it, of what perpetual and ongoing concern and uncertainty does for people. Again, Labor has said that they'll convert TPVs and Chevs to permanent visas. There's anxiety, very rightly so, about when will this happen, because the expectation about it happening is very high. And so that's a matter that we're watching very closely, because we certainly will hope that that Labor moves on that very quickly. And I'm guessing, I think there's sort of an attitude at the moment that we just wait and see for a little while how Labor sort of tracks in terms of their commitments. This one is a number one commitment, but obviously we need to keep an eye on that and just see what happens. And of course, if it doesn't happen in a timely way, then we need to make noises. There's so much that can be said about refugee advocacy, and some of you will be very familiar with it, maybe some not so much. I've been involved since about 2000, maybe early 2001, I can't quite remember exactly. My first awareness of refugees was seeing on the television an image of the Woomera detention centre. And it was a great shot because it was the angle shot from the corner. So you could just see a fence like that in either direction in the desert. And I looked at that and I thought, what is that? The Australian government has sort of operated by stealth. They set up those detention centres way back in 2000 to hide people away, to let the rest of us just carry on, worry about what's for dinner, what are we going to buy at the shops tomorrow, all of these pretty inconsequential things. Meanwhile, the government has been doing these horrendous things to people. Mandatory detention. 1992 it was brought in. Not many people probably were very aware of that or of what was happening. So there has been that tendency to be quite secretive about what actually has been happening for refugees. Combined with that, we've got a pretty apathetic public here in Australia. I think if we ask most people on the street about how important are human rights, what is a human right, I think we get pretty limited answers, generally speaking, not always, but. So I think it's been an easy sort of environment for the government to kind of run a line around people who seek asylum and refugees. I'm just thinking about the time because I could probably talk for a very long time and we probably don't want that to happen. So, of course, 2001 was a very big year. The Tampa. I don't think I need to explain too much about the Tampa, August 26. Children overboard, 15th of October. And then the civics, 352 people drowned when the civics went down. And it wasn't the only boat, and it wasn't the only boat that went down. That's a pretty intense period. And 9/11 on the 1st of whenever in September. So it was a pretty intense kind of time. And as we know, the election was coming on. The Howard government was unpopular, and they seized upon this issue of refugees and really exploited it in a terrible, disgusting way. Children overboard. They played to people's sense of otherness, to the sense that these people are not like us. These are terrible people who somehow will throw their babies overboard. Lies. But it worked a treat on a lot of people in the community. There was heightened fear. September 11 had just happened. All sorts of things came into play, and the government kind of got away with that, at least for a while. It was exposed eventually, but they got away with it. And of course, at that time, it was Nauru was set up, or was it Manus Island? Sue? It's a bit hazy, but anyway, offshore processing was established at that time. Whole swathes of Australian islands and even parts of the Australian mainland were excised, which is a technical thing to say it's no longer technically Australian territory. So we kind of almost rubbed ourselves off the map in an attempt to weaken people's right to seek asylum. Crazy stuff, absolutely crazy stuff. And we know that they were the foundations for the whole regime of punitive policies. We know what they are, offshore, that whole terrible, terrible offshore regime that has seen people stuck in terrible conditions in PNG, detained in very bad conditions in PNG and Nauru for most of the 9 years. And some are still there, not detained, but still marooned, stranded, no future at this point. Some of those people are awaiting resettlement in US, Canada, and now with the New Zealand deal, we're very hopeful that pretty much the remainder might get to New Zealand. But that's been just such a shocking. And I guess if we're thinking about campaigning, and the Kids Off Nauru campaign was probably one of the sort of pivotal moments that when really, and that was 2000 and, I can't remember. Does anyone remember? Anyway, but it was a pivotal moment when we really sort of got some cut through, I think, with the more general consciousness, because it was children, because children were essentially going mad, harming themselves, starving themselves to death in that environment. Just think about that. That was the Australian government doing that to people. It is horrendous. It's a really horrendous story. Another pivotal moment, children again, the Billawheeler family. That's been another sort of cut through moment. It takes a lot to move the Australian people. I remember many years ago, David Mann speaking at a forum. David Mann's a very highly regarded director of refugee legal, has done high court cases and so forth. He asked the rhetorical question, what does it take to make the Australian people blink? In other words, how much cruelty are we prepared to tolerate? And I have to say, had the coalition government been returned, I would have been despairing to some extent of fellow Australians, because you have to think, how much are we prepared to tolerate? I can't say that the election was won on refugee issues, but I'm sure it played into climate change, probably climate change being a key driver. The movement, and I'm probably aware that I should be, so what's made a difference over the time? I mentioned David Mann, I'll just come back to that. There has been a big push through the legal profession to try to secure freedom, justice for people, asylum seekers and refugees. And there have been successes. But what we've seen is that the government has always moved the goalposts. I think there are over 100 amendments to the Migration Act, which is about essentially shifting the goalposts so that to really circumvent the legal challenge. So there's been gains, important gains for some individuals, but the legal system hasn't been able to really remedy the situation. So it's been left to the activists and advocacy community really to bring this issue to the attention of the public. And I'd have to say, it's wonderful to look around here and see the old posters. And I'd like to acknowledge Sue. I know you all know Sue. I know you all know how good she is. But Sue's been involved for such a long time on this issue and so dedicated. And for a very long time, there was Refugee Action Collective, driven mainly through the socialist groups, the left. Pretty much that was it, right through until around 2010. What happened was Kevin Rudd got elected, Labor, they closed the RU, brought people from offshore, fixed the temporary visas, gave permanency. And the refugee movement just went, that's great, isn't it? And a lot of the energy went out of it. Even RAC sort of melted away a little. So many other issues. You can see other issues here too represented. There are always so many issues, aren't there? And so it's understandable that that happened. There was this very small, I remember we used to meet in a very cold, dingy, spiderwebby sort of hall. And a few of us tried to keep something going, and we ran a few public forums. Some of them didn't do very well. People didn't turn up. All the air had gone out of the issue, essentially. A few of us just kept sort of battling on there. Sue Bolton came to me in 2010 and said, now, Mari, I think we should do something about this. The movement's sort of been sort of pretty flat. And it's important that we've got RAC. RAC's kind of maybe showing signs of getting going again, but we need something that's broader, that has a broader base. And this is where the Refugee Advocacy Network came from, and RAC belongs to the network as well. But through the network, we actually try to sort of reach out and to some of the groups that wouldn't necessarily, come along, attend a RAC meeting and be represented there. So that's really what we did with the Refugee Advocacy Network. So we've got, at that time, actually, some of the church groups had refugee advocate type positions. They came on board. Labor for Refugees came on board. A number, Sister Bridget, who actually deserves a mention, I think, in this. I don't know if you're aware that Sister Bridget Arthur, who set up the Bridgetine Asylum Seeker project over 20 years ago, has been recognised with a Queen's Birthday honour, which she said, I don't care much for awards, but I'll suffer it if it brings attention to the movement. And that's so Sister Bridget. She's a wonderful person. She's 87. She gives you hope, being old's not necessarily that bad. She's amazing, the work that she does, thousands of refugees so anyway, she's been a very cool member. Pamela Kerr. So it's been quite a group who have worked with us through the Refugee Advocacy Network. And Palm Sunday, we've led on that. And again, that's been a very, with some criticism in some spaces, but we've been very sort of proactive in reaching into the faith communities, or across all the faith communities, just leveraging off the idea of Palm Sunday being a day that means something to that particular segment of the community. And I think the movement has, in terms of where we've got to, I think that getting a broader sort of range of people, rural Australians for refugees, amazing. On television last night, Leeton, who would have thought a little country town in Leeton would be embracing and celebrating the diversity and embracing refugees and have done that for many years. So rural Australians for refugees, huge, very important as a political movement, not because they're highly sort of political and really aren't necessarily politics. Some of them might be a bit sort of, but the fact that they are people in rural communities who would not necessarily be expected to be challenging a policy of this nature is where they have their power. Likewise with grandmothers for refugees. Who would suspect a grandmother? I've got photographs of grandmothers in their purple outside Parliament House. And I remember one of them was really pushing the boundaries and really, being quite provocative in her own way. There are some very feisty grandmothers out there as well. So I think that breadth in the movement has actually been a really important thing. But you know, the sort of all the way through, the socialist left has been a really key part of that. It's been kind of like a backbone to some extent, I think. And I think that's maybe mostly what I had to say.
Thank you so much, Mari. You gave us a really good, well, you gave us a lot there, but you know, I think we all know a little bit more about who's involved in the refugee movement and the fact that we can't go to sleep just because we've got a new government in power. And we will hear from the speakers again during discussion. But I would like to introduce our next speaker who couldn't make it in person, unfortunately, but she's online. Her name's Atena Kashani. She is an Iranian asylum seeker and high school student who is on a bridging visa, which means she has not received recognition of her refugee status. And she was one of the children the Australian government locked up in detention. I hope, are you ready for your talk, Atena?
Hello, hi everyone. Thank you, Chloe. My name is Atena Kashani. As mentioned before, I am a refugee. But there's more to me than just the title of, you know, refugee up above my head. I'm also a black belt in Taekwondo martial arts. I am a very high achieving student with a GPA of 4.7, 4.8. And I protest and I use my voice because I know that a lot of people that are in my status are not able to do that from the fear. Not only were we in fear from our previous country in which we came to Australia from, but also the fear that, you know, we'll be locked up here as well. You know, it's not something they can't do. You know, they've done it to us before. They'll do it to 90-year-old men and they'll do it to a little child. So I'm one of those people that did get locked up and I was only 9. But the images that I saw there, it's still very vivid in my head. You know, from people begging the officers to let them get some extra food because they were hungry, but the officers being like, no, you can't. To us not having any medical care. So if you fell ill, best of luck to you. You just have to recover for yourself. It's moments like these where you realize, is Australia all paradise? Is it all Eden for us? Are we living in a paradise? Because the reality is that a lot of these issues are actually pushed away from Australia. They're not bringing these topics up because it's insensitive topics. It's going to make people sad. And so voices like myself and other people that are speaking today, our voices are kind of pushed away because, hey, you know, why shed a light on this topic when we can just ignore it? Today I went into my KEPS teacher, which is a person that works with careers, so what you want to do after high school. And I told her, hey, I got accepted into Victoria University, which means that I got into Vic Guaranteed. And I thought that was a great achievement. And we were talking about it. And she said, wait, but aren't you on a bridging visa? And I was like, yeah. And she said, well, that means you're going to have to be an international student. I was like, but I live here. I'm not international. I live in Australia. I've been here for 10 years. And she's like, well, since you don't have a permanent residency or a citizenship, that means you are still an international student unless you get a scholarship, which even then it's not fully covered, or rarely it's fully covered. And so even though I had the certificate that said, congratulations, you've been accepted into Victoria University Guaranteed, it meant nothing to me, because at the end of the day, if I can't pay it, if my parents can't pay the international student, which is so high, we can't go. And that's the issue. That's the main issue that a lot of refugees also have, that we have this talent. We're doing so well in academic wise, but we can't do anything. So why is it that we are not able to go to uni? Why is it that we're not allowed to work? And another thing, me and Chloe were talking about this. She said, some people say Australia, refugees, they are here on welfare. But those same people also say they're here to take our jobs. So which one is it? Are we killing two birds with one stone here? We can't do two things at once. It's ridiculous to say these things. And I think it's a general perspective that we need to change, which we're seeing a lot of change, but also at the same time, the Labor government, as much as I praised for them, I was there 2 weeks in a row, giving out pamphlets to everyone. Hey, Labor is great. You're going to be supporting us. Where is that support back? Why are we not receiving any of the support that was guaranteed to us? So I'm here to say that there is definitely some unfinished work that Labor needs to do. And then again, what happens to people like me that aren't on a TPV because they're getting rid of TPVs, but what about bridging visas? What's going to happen to us? And so I think we really need to step up and kind of get the community together to do something bigger than, Zooms, bigger than protests. We need to make a real movement where we're able to shape the community for the better. So thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you so much, Atena, for taking the time to share with us. And we really do hope you have the right to study here after you finish school next year. And please stick around if you can for discussion. But we are going to have our final speaker, Andrea Bortoli, who is a refugee activist and Socialist Alliance member, who will give us a socialist and also wider global perspective on the reasons why refugees are treated appallingly and why it's happening around the world. Thank you, Andrea.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on stolen lands tonight and pay my respects to elders past, present and future and acknowledge their continuing connection to land. So I've been asked to speak tonight as someone who's involved in the refugee movement in Naarm or Melbourne. But full disclosure, I moved back here about 12 months ago. So I'd really like to acknowledge the work that people like Hassan and Marie and Atena have been doing and other people in this room for many years now, and acknowledge that they have a wealth of knowledge that's beyond mine. So I've only got 10 minutes. I'm hoping to speak to a socialist perspective of the refugee crisis. We need to understand this crisis in a global context to begin to address the root causes alongside continuing the sort of activism that we do every day. Sadly, we know that the appalling treatment of refugees in Australia is only one part of the global picture when it comes to refugees. According to the UNHCR, at the end of 2021, there were some 89.3 million people globally who had been forced to flee their homes. So of these people, about 27.1 million were refugees, 4.6 million were asylum seekers, and many more were displaced, living in limbo in camps, and many who are stateless. So these figures equate to something like 1 in every 88 people in the world displaced. So we're talking about really huge numbers here. So why are we in a situation where so many people across the globe have been and continue to be forcibly displaced? I think we can make a fairly strong and uncontroversial argument here tonight that Western imperialism and the inherent inequalities of the global capitalist system are directly responsible for this. Capitalism is an inherently unequal global economic system that divides the world along the lines of poverty and wealth. So we can consider many examples of when wealthier nations have either openly or covertly supported violent regimes in poorer countries, enabling these regimes to visit violence upon people and forcing them to flee for safety. We can think about the US selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, which were then used to bomb places like Yemen and Gaza. We can think about the UK providing arms to both sides in the Iran-Iraq war because it was economically advantageous to the UK. And we can think about things like, 20 years of intervention, Western intervention in Afghanistan. So armed conflicts in these countries invariably lead to the persecution of ethnic groups and minorities, disruptions to food and medical supply chains, deterioration in living conditions, and destruction of the natural environment and resources. So we're really talking about people who are living in crippling poverty sometimes. The common thread across the world, is that Western countries such as the US, and including Australia under both Liberal and Labor governments, intervene in poorer countries under the guise of bringing stability. However, what they're actually doing is intervening to protect capitalist self-interest and promote their own political and economic interests. And these are the interests of the ruling classes and corporations. So we know that Western imperialism is responsible for creating these circumstances that lead to people being forced to flee. But we also know that capitalism actively works to stop refugees from finding safety when they flee their home countries. Indeed, at every turn, wealthy countries attempt to sort of divert the refugee problem to other places. The burden of taking in refugees is disproportionately and overwhelmingly carried by low and middle income countries. So figures from Amnesty International estimate that around 85% of the global refugee population is actually hosted by countries like Jordan, Turkey, Sudan, Bangladesh, and some of the largest refugee camps in the world are in Bangladesh. So essentially, wealthy countries are running around furthering their own self-interest and chasing profits while creating destabilisation in poorer countries, and then imposing brutal border policies to keep people from seeking safety. We're really familiar with the cruel and punitive policies enacted under our sovereign borders policy here in Australia. So boat turnbacks, offshore processing. But this militarisation of borders is actually happening around the world. So one of the more recent and sort of quite literal examples of a border wall is the Mexico-US southern wall. But, you know, around the world in Europe, we see walls have been built in Poland, Spain, Greece, Calais in France to keep refugees out. And what we know about these border walls is that they don't stop people from attempting to seek safety. They just push people towards more dangerous options. And we've all seen, countless times that, harrowing footage of people who have been, for example, fleeing across the Mediterranean or the English Channel. So in 2022, the UK government will pay French authorities an estimated £54 million to stop people attempting to cross the English Channel on the French side. The UK has also recently shored up a £120 million deal to deport UK asylum seekers entering the UK to Rwanda. And Rwanda is a country with well-known shortcomings in its treatment of refugees. Closer to home, the Australian government, last financial year just gone, spent $957 million in maintaining offshore border policies. So it seems that outsourcing border control is an essential feature of capitalism today. In the asylum pamphlet, Nathan Akehurst points out that outsourcing border control to poorer nations reduces financial and political costs to the countries that are doing this, and essentially subcontracts the violence of these policies offshore. Alongside the militarisation of borders comes the demonisation and dehumanisation of refugees, which you've sort of spoken to tonight, Hassan. We can see this language used by governments, so often, using terms like illegal arrivals. And we know much of this language is rooted in racism and xenophobia. There's also lots of moral crusading type language that's used, particularly around people smuggling. For example, we hear governments justifying inhumane policies by saying that they're saving lives at sea. And as I've already mentioned, we know that these policies don't save lives. They cost lives when people are forced to flee via more dangerous routes. Again, referencing the pamphlet, Dave Holmes makes the point that this sort of language around asylum seeking is actually really carefully designed political propaganda aimed at distracting us from the actual threat that capitalism poses. And the reality is that refugees aren't a threat. Wealthy nations like Australia can actually afford to take in thousands or hundreds of thousands more refugees than they already do. All the big social issues that we're facing at the moment, so things like homelessness, low wages, cost of living, inequitable access to health and education, none of these problems are caused by refugees. These crises that we're facing are actually a result of unrestrained capitalism and a profit-driven system. So refugees are actually some of the most oppressed people under these systems. Unfortunately, when we look forward, there doesn't really seem to be an easing of this crisis in sight. In fact, the impending catastrophe of climate change will further fuel this crisis. So thinking about this region, climate change will mean that many Pacific islands will be uninhabitable in the next 50 years or so, leaving hundreds of thousands of people displaced. And how can we forget our former immigration minister and current opposition leader infamously joking in 2015 about water lapping at the doorsteps of Pacific Island nations. And, you know, he said this at a roundtable on immigration. So, you know, thinking about this, we aren't going to see a sudden reversal in this sort of callous attitude that the ruling classes have towards displaced people as a result of climate change. We can already see the way the capitalist system treats people here in Australia who have been displaced after the recent floods in New South Wales and Queensland, with, you know, hundreds, thousands, perhaps people still waiting on government assistance and essentially homeless. Further afield, climate change is wreaking havoc already. For example, levels of food insecurity in places like Somalia and Ethiopia are at an all-time high. In 2020, they began their years with some of the most severe droughts ever seen, and then ended the year with some of the wettest wet seasons they'd ever seen, with extreme weather events such as cyclones killing hundreds. So the effects of climate change will increasingly compound the political and economic instability, poverty and persecution that sees refugees flee from their home countries. So we can see that the refugee crisis is huge. It's increasingly complex when we consider escalating and accelerating climate change, and it's largely driven by Western imperialism and capitalist self-interest. So where do we start in trying to solve this crisis? What can we do to alleviate the suffering that's imposed upon people? Ultimately, what we need is fundamental and transformative social change. Solutions to the refugee crisis can be found in small and large actions. So what do these actions look like? They look like fighting for radically more liberal policies towards refugees. So in the Australian context, this looks like ending mandatory detention, ending violent border policies like boat turnbacks, and instead welcoming refugees, providing permanent protection visas, and massively expanding our intake by hundreds of thousands. It also looks like massive expansion of social services like public housing, welfare, access to health and education, all services that are of benefit to refugees, but also the wider community. Looks like radical climate action and urgent mitigation of the effects of climate change, and massively increasing aid to countries that are most affected by climate change. On a bigger scale, it looks like continuing to dismantle the systems of capitalism that have created this crisis by fighting for people before profit, and supporting movements that are doing this across the world. And lastly, of course, it's continuing grassroots activism by showing up and building the movement, particularly after the last 3 years of the pandemic, where some of these movements have sort of decelerated. And I think a big part of that is being events like this. So I'd also, you know, again, thank Hassan, Marie and Atena, who's online, for being here, because this is a big part of it as well.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I think you brought up so much in your talk, and you did bring up some good examples and reminded me of how the government has really constantly always trying to find ways to undermine people's humanitarian instincts and distort people's everyday people's thinking, people who don't follow politics, and just keep finding ways to manipulate public opinion against refugees, like using words like illegals, certain language that can sway even very progressive people. Well, before we stop the live stream, we'll go to a discussion next, but before we, I know that, there might be people following us on live stream. I'd just like to encourage people to read the pamphlet. There it is. Oh, I don't know if I'm showing it properly, if you can see it, I don't know if the words are backwards, maybe, but it's, that's the pamphlet that we're launching tonight. It's called Asylum, A Socialist View of the Refugee Crisis. And it's a really important contribution to what's going on with refugees today, not just in Australia, but worldwide. And it also explains some of the myths and lies told about asylum seekers and refugees. So if you can, we'd love for you to buy a copy, and you can come into the Resistance Centre bookshop at 407 Swanston Street, level 5, or purchase it online at www.resistancebooks.com. And yeah, people watching over the live stream, if you'd like to join us on the Zoom, you're welcome to for discussion, but we'll be ending it now. So goodbye, and thank you for listening. Stay in touch, and stay in touch with Socialist Alliance and Green Left, and we'll keep fighting for the free movement of people across borders, especially those seeking asylum, and show solidarity in place of racism and xenophobia. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining this live stream. As we said before, if you like our work, please do become a Green Left supporter. It's the best way to help our campaigns and to receive the content that we produce. Without spending a cent, you can also put a thumbs up on this video. Please share this video. Obviously, the algorithm likes it if you comment and subscribe, so please do those things. And we'd love to have your support in any ways that you're able to help in future. Thanks everybody for joining us. If you're listening live and want to participate in the Q&A, you can go to the Green Left Facebook page, find the Zoom link there, and participate that way. Thanks, everyone.